So today marks the 70th anniversary, as you know, of the landing of Allied troops on the beaches of Normandy, and what turned out to be the very beginning of the end of World War II. The greatest assembly in the history of the world of forces assembled for good to eradicate evil and to fight tyranny. And if you saw any of the ceremonies that were on TV today and or the documentaries leading up to it, and I'm sure over the next few days, we get just a glimpse of how incredibly powerful that moment was. Even for those of us that didn't live through that time, that know it only through stories either of grandparents that served or parents that served, or through films that have documented the incredible heroism not only on the battlefront, but the incredible unity of the Allied forces and the world in this courageous fight, the unity of individuals, of companies and corporations, of even governments and politicians to overcome their sort of built-in self-interest and to do something for the greater good. Collectively, we look at that war as a just and great war. Its soldiers stand out for us as members of what Tom Brokaw called the greatest generation. And rightfully, we revere them for their sacrifice and their service. We stand in awe of that period of time, and it has grown in mythic proportion in the way that black and white images become colorful in our mind. And we shade over probably what was the rough spots and the disagreements. And we see them as time goes on as so pure of heart and of purpose. So it's ironic to me then, sadly ironic, the juxtaposition of this 70th anniversary of D-Day with the now very public battle over the right or wrong of the redeeming of Sergeant Bowe Bergdahl from captivity after 5 years with the Taliban. And if you've been following this story in the news, you know that Sergeant Bergdahl was exchanged for 5 senior Taliban leaders that were imprisoned at Guantanamo Bay by the U.S. military. And if you've been following the story, you know that what would seem to be a pretty straightforward example of a military not leaving a soldier on the battlefield, a code and a creed that exists, I am assuming, in all free world forces, military forces around the world, that it is not without tremendous controversy. Some say that Bergdahl, who left his post a few times before ultimately being captured by the Taliban, was a deserter, that he had written notes that he was done with the army, he was done with the war, that he was fed up with it all, and that he simply walked away from his post, and that the U.S. military had no responsibility then to rescue him because he had abandoned them. Some say that he actually sought to join the enemy, that he was seeking them out so as to become a turncoat and fight against his own forces. Others say that the price of 5 for 1 was too high a price to pay. Others point that soldiers lost their lives trying to rescue Bergdahl in the immediate days and weeks following his capture, and that to be, as citing back again his turncoat ways, if you would, that it wasn't worth risking more lives. And some say actually, and this is just, it's very difficult even to repeat, that Bergdahl's father, who learned Pashto, the language of the captors, of his son's captors, and grew a beard unshaven for every day that his son was in captivity, and you see pictures of him in the White House Rose Garden, and they say, well, his father, who is not a Muslim, has become a Muslim, and therefore his son is not worthy of redemption. They are scurrilous things, that he's a sympathizer, therefore. And there are other charges of politics, of illegality, that President Obama violated an act of Congress, of conspiracy theories. Those abound all the time. In some, it would appear that this clear case of bringing a boy home to his parents on the battlefield is, for many, not so clear at all, or it is clearly in some a case of politics and of misplaced priorities. But it is crystal clear for Judaism. It is crystal clear in the eyes of Jewish law. The admonition to redeem the captive, Pidyon Shavuim, appears in the Torah, it appears in the writings of the prophets, it is in the Talmud, it is in the Shulchan Aruch, it's in the writings of Maimonides, the great medieval scholar who was so wonderful to crystallize in his collections of commentaries the essence of Jewish tradition. And so in one of those, Maimonides wrote the following about redeeming the captive. He wrote, "The redeeming of captives takes precedence over the feeding and clothing of the poor. Indeed, there is no religious duty more important than the redeeming of captives. For not only is the captive included in the generality of the hungry, the thirsty, and the naked, but his very life is in jeopardy." So important, our tradition says, is the redeeming of a captive or a hostage that a synagogue can sell every single one of its Torahs to pay the ransom to redeem a captive, even if the ransom is unreasonable. I mean, just think for a moment what Maimonides is presenting to us here, that the Judaism, which is based so firmly on to look out for the widow, the orphan, and the stranger, the poor and the hungry, Maimonides says that this takes precedent over that. More important to redeem the captive than to feed the hungry, to care for the widow, the orphan, the stranger. That's how important this mitzvah of Pidyon Shavuim is in Jewish tradition. David Brooks, a politically conservative commentator who writes for the New York Times, wrote the following this week about the Bergdahl case. He says, "It doesn't matter if Bergdahl had deserted his post or not. It doesn't matter if he is a confused young man who said insulting and shameful things about his country and his army. The debt a nation owes to its soldiers in uniform is not based on individual merit. It is based on citizenship and on loyalty to the national community we all share." He then concluded, he says, "Soldiers don't risk their lives only for those citizens who deserve it. They do it for the nation as a whole." Brooks points out in his article, and we all know very well because actually he came and spoke here in this congregation, and this community of Canadian Jewry was so supportive, that Israel has actually set the example of this throughout the world. It's unfortunate that it's been necessary, but Israel traded 1,027 Palestinian prisoners for one Israeli soldier, Gilad Shalit, who spoke right here from this bima. Israel traded 1,150 prisoners for 3 soldiers just to return their remains to their families. They did it because of a deep awareness that national cohesion is essential to national survival. Israel did it because Israeli parents share a common emotional bond. The imprisonment of one of their children touches all of them. And if you've been in Israel, you know that everyone is connected to the military through service, through neighbors, through friends, and that when something happens to one, it is like the ripple effects on a still pond. It percolates out, it happens to everyone. In polarized countries, and America is a very polarized country, and Canada in parts is too, you have to take care of your own. If you don't, then the corrosive effects become cumulative. As soon as you say, this person is not worthy, this group doesn't deserve, then that begins to percolate and go and go and go. Torah says in this week's Torah portion that we should have one law for citizens and non-citizens. One law for everyone, not rights for you and different rights for you. Not save the soldiers who you like, but not the soldiers that you don't. So 70 years ago today, Tens of thousands of soldiers risked their lives for an ideal. And in doing that, they unified a world, the free world, for 7 decades. That ideal served as the basis for the United Nations, for all the good works that nations of freedom and democracy have tried to do in the world. It was a Jewish ideal on a massive scale. It was as simple as every human being, every person, is born kedai, is born worthy. That every life has meaning and intrinsic value. That every human being is created in God's image. And therefore the redemption of those that are in suffering or in danger is an act of pikuach nefesh. It is an act of saving the life of another. And we know well the story, we know well the teaching in Jewish tradition that to save one life is to save the entire world. This week, on a smaller scale, a politician, a president who has very little political capital left to risk, did the same thing. The risk was not in any way comparable to those on the battlefield, but the cause was a microcosm of the same 70 years ago, of that act of pikuach nefesh, of doing something to save one life so as to redeem the entire world. It was the right thing to do. And if you have a conversation, you can say your rabbi said that. Because the Torah says that. It was the right thing to do. It was a mitzvah. It was an act of chesed, of compassion. And should it be necessary, because it will be necessary, to do something like that again, he and we should do it again, because it's the right thing to do. Shabbat Shalom. Our service continues, page 586. We rise for Aleinu.